The night my daughter changed the locks, it was 22 degrees outside, and I had my purse, my reading glasses, and the cardigan I'd grabbed off the back of the kitchen chair because I thought we were just having another argument. I didn't even have my phone charger. I stood on the porch of the house I'd lived in for 31 years. The house where I'd raised her, painted the shutters twice, planted the hydrangeas along the front walk, and I knocked. I knocked like a stranger, because that's what I was now. She didn't answer. My name is Vivian. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years as a licensed practical nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. I've held the hands of dying strangers. I've talked people through the worst nights of their lives. I thought I knew what hard looked like. I did not know. It started the way these things always start, slowly. So slowly you almost don't notice until you're already inside it. My husband, Gerald, no, wait. My husband's name was Leonard. Leonard passed in the spring of 2019, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, we had 41 years together. I didn't know how to be a person without him in the house. My daughter Diane was the one who suggested I sell the place in Gahanna and move closer to her and her husband in Westerville. You shouldn't be rattling around in that big house alone, Mum, she said. She said it so gently. Like she meant it. I believed her. That's what I keep coming back to. I believed her. I sold the house for $287,000. Leonard and I had paid it off 11 years before he died. That money, every cent, went into a joint account that Diane helped me set up because, she explained, it would make it easier to manage my bills now that I was moving somewhere new. Her name was on the account. Just for convenience, she said. Just for convenience. I moved into the in-law suite they'd added onto the back of their house. It was nice, actually. Small but sunny. I had my own bathroom, a little sitting area, a door that locked from the inside. For a while, things were fine. I cooked for them sometimes. I watched my grandchildren on Thursday afternoons. Her husband Todd was quiet around me in a way I told myself was just shyness. It wasn't shyness. The first time I noticed something was off, I asked Diane about the utility deposit I'd paid when I set up my account at the new branch. $340. I couldn't find the record of it. She got very still. Mom, I already handled that. You don't need to worry about the small stuff. I was a woman who had balanced her own checkbook every month for 40 years. I did not consider $340 to be small stuff, but I let it go because she was my daughter, because I was tired and I was grieving and I wanted things to be easy for once. That was my first mistake. The second came about 8 months in, when I asked her to set up online access so I could see the account myself. She kept saying she'd get to it. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. Then one day I drove to the bank directly and asked the teller to help me. I sat in that plastic chair at the little desk and I watched the teller's face change. The account had $4,200 in it. I had deposited $287,000. I asked her to print the statement. My hands were shaking so badly I folded it wrong twice before I got it into my purse. I drove back to the house and I sat in my little sunny room and I read every line. Transfers, withdrawals, a payment to a home renovation company I'd never heard of. A payment to what I eventually figured out was a car dealership. The same month, Todd got a new truck, groceries, vacations, a furniture store, my retirement, Leonard's life insurance, the house we'd scraped to pay off. Gone. I confronted Diane that evening after the kids were in bed. I spread that bank statement on the kitchen table and I asked her to explain it to me, she cried. Todd stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said I was being dramatic, that Diane had been managing my finances because I'd been showing signs of confusion. They'd been meaning to talk to me about assisted living. Assisted living. I am a woman who still does the crossword in pen. I said I wanted to speak to an attorney. Diane said, and I will never forget this as long as I live. She said, Mom, if you do that, you can't stay here anymore. I said I understood. She changed the locks the next morning. I won't tell you that the weeks that followed were okay because they weren't. I had $4,200 and no place to go. My friends in Gahanna had scattered the way people do after a spouse dies. Some moved, some drifted, some just didn't know what to say anymore. I checked into a motel off Route 161 for the first 2 weeks, watching my money drain like a bathtub. I applied for emergency housing assistance through Franklin County. I went to my church. I sat in the office of a legal aid attorney named Mr. Okafor, who listened to everything I said and then told me as kindly as he could that because I had voluntarily added Diane's name to the account, the situation was legally complicated. Complicated. There's a word that costs people everything. By late November, the motel was out of the question. A woman I'd met at the legal aid office told me about a shelter over on Mound Street. I lasted 4 nights. It wasn't the conditions. I've worked in hospitals. I can handle hard conditions. It was the noise at 3 a.m, the sound of other women crying through thin walls, and the understanding that at 67 years old I had become someone who needed a shelter bed. I left before dawn on the 5th morning, and I walked. I don't know where I thought I was going. It was December. I found a bench near Schiller Park under an overhang by the old bathhouse, and I sat there because I didn't know what else to do. I sat there for 2 days. I ate a granola bar I found at the bottom of my purse. A young man walking his dog gave me his coffee without me asking. I didn't cry. I think I was past crying. I just sat there and watched the light change on the water and thought about Leonard and thought about how none of this was how it was supposed to go. That's where my brother found me. His name is Victor. He's 72, 4 years older than me. We grew up together in Dayton, shared a bedroom wall, fought over the television, drove each other crazy the way siblings do. When he enlisted and went to Vietnam at 19, I wrote him every single week. When he came back changed and quiet and too thin, I was the one who sat with him in the kitchen at 2 a.m. without making him talk. We had a falling out, a real one, about 12 years ago. It was about our mother's estate after she died. Something about a piece of furniture and old resentments that had nothing to do with a sideboard and everything to do with all the things families never say directly. We stopped talking. Years passed. Leonard tried to broker a reconciliation once, and it almost worked, but then didn't. I hadn't spoken to Victor in 9 years. He found me because of a letter. I had written to him 3 months earlier, before things got truly desperate, when I was still at the motel and still had some composure, because I didn't know who else to write to. I didn't expect anything. I wasn't even sure I had the right address. I just needed to tell someone the truth of what was happening to me, and he was the only person I could think of who had known me my whole life. The letter found him in Phoenix, where he'd been living since he retired from the County Roads Department in 2018. He told me later he read it 4 times. Then he got in his truck and drove to Columbus. It took him 2 days to track down where I was. He'd gone to Diane's house first. She'd told him I'd had a breakdown and was receiving psychiatric care, and she said it so smoothly, so convincingly, that he almost believed her. But Victor has spent his whole life reading people in situations where being wrong was dangerous. He knew something was off. He found me on that bench on a Thursday morning in December, grey and cold with the threat of snow in the air. He sat down next to me without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Vivian, I'm sorry it took me this long." I didn't have anything to say to that. I put my head on his shoulder and I cried for the first time in weeks. Victor was not a wealthy man. He had his VA benefits, his Social Security, a modest savings account. He was not going to write me a check for $250,000, but what he had was something worth more to me at that moment. He had his word, and he had the kind of stubborn, patient fury that men like him carry very quietly until they need it. He put me up at a residence inn while he got to work. He paid for 2 weeks up front in cash. He found me a real attorney, not legal aid, not free. A woman named Patricia Samuels, who specialized in financial elder abuse cases, and who did not change her expression at all when I handed her that bank statement, which told me she had seen far worse. She told me what we were dealing with. She told me it was serious. She also told me that because the amounts involved were substantial and the documentation was clear, we had a case. Victor sold his boat. He had a small fishing boat he'd had for 15 years, something he'd talked about on the phone to Leonard, like it was a third child. He sold it and put the money toward my legal retainer without mentioning it until months later, like it was nothing. It was not nothing. What happened over the next 8 months I can only describe as the most exhausting, most clarifying experience of my life. There were depositions, there were financial forensics. There was a very uncomfortable afternoon when Diane sat across a conference table from me, and I had to look at my own daughter and understand that the person she had become was not someone I recognized. She had an explanation for everything. The transfers were for my care. The renovations were for my benefit. Todd sat beside her and nodded at everything she said. I sat across from them with my hands folded on the table, and I did not look away once. The judge did not find their explanations persuasive. Here is what I want to tell you about the courtroom, because people always ask. It was not dramatic. It was not like television. It was fluorescent lights and long pauses and a lot of paper. When the ruling came, I was sitting next to Victor, and I was wearing the blazer I'd bought at Goodwill, because it was the nicest thing I owned, and when the judge said what he said, Victor reached over and put his hand on mine. That was it. That was the moment. The court ordered restitution. It wasn't the full amount. Diane and Todd had spent a significant portion, and restitution is not a magic wand, but combined with what could be clawed back from frozen accounts and the order of sale on Todd's truck, I recovered $198,000. Attorney Samuels had worked a portion of her fee on contingency. Victor got paid back for the boat. There was still a number missing from what should have been mine, but I was not going to spend the rest of my life inside a courtroom. Diane did not go to jail. I want to be honest about that, because the people who watch these stories always want there to be a cell door closing, and I understand why. She received 3 years of probation, mandatory financial crime counseling, and a civil judgment that will follow her credit report for the next 20 years. Whether that is justice, I have made my peace with not knowing. What I know is this: I have enough now. I live in a small rental apartment in Clintonville, just north of Columbus, A two-bedroom because Victor visits often enough that I gave him a key. My neighbours are a young couple on one side and an older man named Harold on the other, who brings me tomatoes from his garden every August like clockwork. I have my own bank account in my name only, and I check it every single week. I went back to volunteer at St. Catherine's, not nursing anymore, but sitting with patients who don't have family nearby. I know what it is to need someone to just sit with you. I know what it costs when no one does. Victor and I talk on the phone every Sunday, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours. We are still figuring out how to be siblings after everything. The 9 years of silence, the falling out over a piece of furniture, all of it sits between us, but differently now, the way old injuries do when they've finally healed enough to touch. I think about Leonard a lot. I think he would be furious about what happened in that quiet way he had where the fury went very deep and very still. And then I think he'd make coffee and sit down at the table and say, okay, what's next? That's what I'm working on. What's next? My hydrangeas are gone. Whoever bought the Gahanna house ripped them out and put in a concrete pad. A neighbour told me, and I felt it like a small physical thing in my chest. But last spring I planted 2 new ones in pots on my balcony, blue as the ones I remember, and they bloomed all the way into October. I didn't think I was a person who could start over at 68. Turns out I didn't need to start over. I just needed to keep going. And the people who tried to make me believe otherwise, well, they found out that keeping going was something I was very, very good at.